The dust particles danced in the bright cone of light as the 16mm projector rattled to life in the converted barracks. Kim Sung-ho, a former sergeant in the Korean People's Army, sat cross-legged on the rough wooden floor, his dark eyes fixed on the white sheet stretched between two posts that served as a makeshift screen. Around him, dozens of other North Korean prisoners of war shifted nervously, whispering in hushed tones as they watched their American captors thread film through the mysterious machine. It was December 1951, deep in the second year of the Korean War, and Kim had expected many things when he was captured near Seoul 6 months earlier. He had expected interrogation, punishment, perhaps even execution. What he had never expected was this: to be sitting in relative comfort in an American prison camp, about to watch a Hollywood movie for entertainment. The very concept seemed impossible, like something from a fever dream. The film began, and suddenly Charlie Chaplin's Little Tramp appeared on screen, his iconic bowler hat and cane immediately recognizable even to men who had never seen a motion picture in their lives. Kim watched in stunned silence as the tramp struggled with the machinery of modern industrial life, getting caught in enormous gears and fighting against assembly line efficiency. Around him, other prisoners began to chuckle tentatively, then more boldly. The physical comedy transcended all barriers of language and ideology. Here was humor that spoke to something universal in the human experience. But for Kim and his fellow prisoners, this moment represented far more than simple entertainment. It was their first glimpse into a world so alien to their own experience that it might as well have been another planet. They were witnessing American abundance, American confidence, and American power expressed in the most unexpected way imaginable, through the casual decision to show Hollywood movies to enemy prisoners of war. This is the story of that encounter, and what it revealed about two radically different approaches to warfare, society, and human nature itself. The war had begun in June 1950 when North Korean forces poured across the 38th parallel in what they believed would be a swift reunification of their divided homeland. Kim Sung-ho had been among those early troops, a young man filled with revolutionary fervor and absolute confidence in the righteousness of their cause. They had been told that the Americans were paper tigers, weak capitalists who would flee at the first sign of real resistance. The South Korean forces would collapse, and the puppet government in Seoul would fall within days. Instead, Kim found himself part of a grinding conflict that consumed the Korean peninsula in flames and consumed hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides. By the time he was captured in late 1951, the initial confidence had long since given way to grim determination and, if he was honest with himself, growing doubts about the inevitable victory they had been promised. The moment of capture itself had been profoundly disorienting. Kim had expected to be shot immediately, or at best subjected to the kind of brutal interrogation that North Korean forces routinely inflicted on their own prisoners. Instead, he found himself being processed through what seemed like an elaborate bureaucratic system. American soldiers checked his wounds, gave him medical attention, and provided him with his first real meal in weeks: canned meat, white bread, and coffee that was bitter but hot. The prison camp where Kim was eventually taken was unlike anything he could have imagined. It wasn't the torture chamber or death camp that North Korean propaganda had prepared him for. Instead, it was a carefully organized facility with rows of barracks, mess halls, medical facilities, and even recreational areas. The Americans, he gradually realized, were running their prison camps according to the Geneva Convention, treating prisoners of war as human beings with rights rather than as enemies to be destroyed. The abundance was what struck him first. 3 meals a day, served regularly without fail. Medical care that included actual medicines and equipment he had never seen before. Clean clothing distributed on a schedule. Even luxuries like tobacco and writing materials. For a man who had spent months eating whatever he could forage while fighting a war of desperate scarcity, the steady flow of supplies into the camp seemed almost magical. But it was the movies that truly boggled his mind. The Americans had somehow managed to establish a regular schedule of film screenings using portable projection equipment. Twice a week, weather permitting, prisoners could gather in the converted barracks to watch Hollywood films that had been shipped thousands of miles across the Pacific through complex military supply lines, just to provide entertainment for enemy prisoners of war. The first time Kim saw the projection equipment being set up, He was certain it was some form of propaganda tool or psychological warfare device. The Americans were going to force them to watch films that glorified capitalism or demonized communism. He braced himself for torture of a different kind, a relentless assault on his ideological convictions. Instead, he found himself watching Charlie Chaplin getting tangled up in factory machinery. There was no political message that he could detect, no obvious propaganda. It was simply comedy, physical humor that made people laugh regardless of their political beliefs or national origins. The revelation was profound and deeply unsettling. As the weeks passed and more films were shown, Kim began to understand something that challenged everything he had been taught about American society. These movies weren't propaganda in any sense he recognized. They weren't uniformly positive about American life. Some showed poverty, some showed wealth, some showed conflict and criticism of American institutions. What they shared was something else entirely. The assumption that entertainment could exist for its own sake, that art and laughter and storytelling were valuable in themselves, not just as tools for political indoctrination. The variety was staggering. Disney cartoons with their explosion of color and music, westerns that showed rugged individualism and frontier violence, comedies that poked fun at everything from marriage to capitalism itself, newsreels that showed American cities, factories, farms, and families going about their daily lives with a casual confidence that suggested they expected good things to happen. Kim found himself particularly fascinated by the newsreels. Here were glimpses of American civilian life that contradicted everything he had been told about capitalist society. He saw supermarkets with aisles full of food, more variety in a single store than existed in entire North Korean provinces. He saw suburban neighborhoods where ordinary families owned automobiles, lived in houses with lawns, and gathered around dinner tables laden with abundance. He saw children playing in parks with equipment that seemed designed purely for enjoyment, not for building character or preparing for military service. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. According to everything Kim had been taught, capitalist society was supposed to be characterized by exploitation, inequality, and misery for the working masses. Yet here were images of American workers leaving factories not in exhaustion but chatting casually, some heading to their own cars, others stopping at local diners for meals that looked more substantial than what North Korean officers received. Fellow prisoner Park Min-soo, a former lieutenant in an artillery unit, put it most succinctly during one of their whispered evening conversations. Look at their faces in these films. They're not afraid. They move through their world as if they expect it to provide for them, as if abundance is normal rather than miraculous. It was true. The Americans in the newsreels and feature films displayed a casual confidence that seemed to assume plenty rather than scarcity, opportunity rather than limitation, hope rather than mere survival. Even when the films showed problems, poverty, conflict, social issues, they seemed to suggest that such problems could be addressed, that solutions were possible, that individual initiative and social cooperation could create better outcomes. The logistics of the film operation were themselves a revelation. Every movie that reached their camp had traveled thousands of miles from Hollywood studios to military distribution centers, across the Pacific by ship or plane, through the same supply networks that delivered ammunition and medical supplies to frontline troops. The Americans had somehow created a system so efficient and abundant that they could afford to ship entertainment to prison camps in active war zones. When projection bulbs burned out, replacements appeared. When film broke, it was repaired by guards who seemed to take the maintenance of the equipment for granted. The Americans inhabited a world where complex technical systems were expected to function, where abundance was routine rather than miraculous, where even temporary facilities deserved investment in comfort and morale. Kim began to understand that the movies were just the visible symbol of something much larger and more profound. The same industrial system that could mass-produce entertaining films could also mass-produce weapons, vehicles, and supplies at rates that North Korea could never hope to match. The same organizational culture that assumed prisoners of war deserved entertainment also assumed that complex logistical challenges could be solved through efficient planning and abundant resources. The contrast with his own military experience was stark and troubling. North Korean forces operated on principles of scarcity, sacrifice, and ideological purity. Soldiers were expected to endure hardship as a test of revolutionary commitment. Supplies were limited, equipment was often improvised, and entertainment was considered a bourgeois luxury that weakened fighting spirit. The idea that military effectiveness might actually be enhanced by keeping troops comfortable, entertained, and connected to civilian culture was completely alien to North Korean military doctrine. As winter gave way to spring in 1952, Kim found himself looking forward to the movie screenings with an anticipation that he knew would have horrified his former political instructors. He had begun to see the films not just as entertainment, but as windows into a completely different way of thinking about human society and human potential. The Disney cartoons were perhaps the most revelatory of all. Here was an entire animated universe created purely for the sake of beauty, wonder, and joy. The technical sophistication required to produce such films was staggering. Thousands of individual drawings, complex musical scores, sophisticated recording equipment, all marshaled to create stories about mice conducting orchestras or princesses singing to forest animals. The sheer extravagance of devoting such resources to pure fantasy seemed almost decadent to men raised in a culture of revolutionary austerity. But it was also undeniably appealing. Kim found himself enchanted by the color, the music, the imaginative worlds that Disney's artists had created. There was something profoundly human about the impulse to create beauty for its own sake, to tell stories that served no practical purpose except to make people happy. The fact that American society could afford such luxuries, could devote enormous resources to pure entertainment, suggested a level of prosperity and security that seemed almost mythical. The feature films provided different insights. American movies didn't present a uniformly positive view of American society. They showed corruption, inequality, conflict, and moral ambiguity. They acknowledged problems and contradictions in ways that North Korean propaganda never did. This willingness to engage in public self-criticism, to air social tensions and personal conflicts for mass entertainment, represented a kind of confidence that Kim had never encountered before. In North Korea, all public art served the state. Films, books, music, and theater were tools for building revolutionary consciousness and loyalty to the leadership. The idea that entertainment could question authority, explore personal relationships, or simply tell stories for the sake of storytelling was not just foreign, it was subversive. Yet here were the Americans, apparently confident enough in their system to allow and even celebrate artistic works that criticized aspects of their own society. Captain Lee Jong-soo, a former pilot who had been shot down over Incheon, often joined Kim for their post-screening discussions. What kind of society, Lee would ask, is so secure that it can't afford to criticize itself in public? What kind of government is so confident that it allows artists to question its policies for mass entertainment? The question haunted many of the prisoners as 1952 progressed and reports from the front lines became increasingly grim for North Korean forces. The Americans weren't just winning battles. They were demonstrating a form of power that went far beyond military superiority. They were showing an ability to maintain complex systems, to provide abundance even in wartime, to project culture and values across vast distances, and to do all of this while treating even their enemies with a level of humanity that seemed almost incomprehensible. The movie screenings had become the highlight of many prisoners' weeks. Men who had once viewed any form of entertainment as weakness now found themselves eagerly anticipating the next Charlie Chaplin comedy or Disney cartoon. Some had even begun to learn English words from the films, picking up phrases and expressions that they practiced among themselves during work details and recreation periods. The transformation wasn't just linguistic, it was psychological. Kim began to realize that his understanding of strength, power, and social organization had been fundamentally challenged by his exposure to American popular culture. The North Korean model emphasized sacrifice, discipline, and ideological purity as the foundations of national strength. The American model, as revealed through Hollywood movies and prison camp life, seemed to emphasize abundance, efficiency, and individual happiness as equally important foundations of social power. By the summer of 1952, Kim had filled several notebooks with observations about American society, gleaned from movies and daily life in the camp. He wrote about the casual waste he observed, guards throwing away half-eaten sandwiches, discarding newspapers after reading them once, replacing equipment that still functioned but wasn't quite perfect. For someone raised in a culture of scarcity, such waste seemed almost criminal. But he was beginning to understand that it was also a form of strength, evidence of productive capacity so vast that efficiency mattered less than abundance. The prison camp itself operated like a small American city. Regular supply deliveries brought fresh food, medical supplies, and consumer goods. The electrical system functioned reliably, providing power for lighting, refrigeration, and movie projectors. Water flowed from taps, waste was disposed of through organized systems, and even entertainment was scheduled and delivered with the same reliability as meals and medical care. Kim began to see these systems not as luxuries, but as expressions of a fundamentally different approach to organizing human society. Where North Korean culture emphasized collective sacrifice for future goals, American culture seemed to emphasize immediate satisfaction and individual comfort as routes to collective prosperity. Where North Korean organization relied on ideological commitment and personal discipline, American organization seemed to rely on technical systems and material incentives. The implications were profound and disturbing. If the Americans could maintain such systems even in prison camps thousands of miles from home, while simultaneously fighting a global war against multiple enemies, what did that say about their overall capacity? If they could afford to show Hollywood movies to enemy prisoners, what other resources did they have at their disposal? As 1952 turned into 1953 and rumors of possible armistice negotiations began to circulate through the camp, many prisoners found themselves facing an uncomfortable question. What would it mean to return to North Korea after witnessing American abundance? How could they go back to a society built on scarcity after experiencing one built on plenty? The question became more urgent as the war ground toward its conclusion. Reports filtered into the camp about the massive bombing campaigns that had devastated North Korean cities and infrastructure. American B-29 bombers, operating from bases that seemed impossibly distant, had systematically destroyed bridges, factories, power plants, and transportation networks throughout North Korea. The same productive capacity that could create Hollywood entertainment could also project devastating military power across vast distances. Kim found himself torn between loyalty to his homeland and growing admiration for American efficiency and abundance. He had been raised to believe that ideological purity and revolutionary commitment were the highest virtues, more important than material comfort or personal happiness. But his months in American custody had shown him a society that seemed to combine material prosperity with individual freedom in ways that his political education had taught him were impossible. The final movie screening that Kim would attend came in June 1953, just weeks before the armistice that would end active hostilities in Korea. The film was It's a Wonderful Life, a story about an American banker who learns to appreciate the value of community and personal relationships over material success. Kim watched in fascination as Jimmy Stewart's character struggled with despair and discovered meaning through connection to family and neighbors. The movie's message was complex and nuanced in ways that North Korean propaganda never allowed. It celebrated both individual achievement and community solidarity, both material progress and spiritual values, both American prosperity and the recognition that prosperity alone wasn't enough to ensure happiness. It was a kind of self-reflection and social criticism that seemed to assume audiences were sophisticated enough to handle complexity and contradiction. As the credits rolled and the projector clicked to a stop, Kim realized that his understanding of the world had been fundamentally altered by his exposure to American popular culture. The movies hadn't converted him to capitalism or made him reject his homeland, but they had shown him that there were other ways to organize society, other definitions of strength and success, other possibilities for human flourishing than those he had been taught to consider. The armistice negotiations that summer of 1953 brought new uncertainties. Many prisoners would be repatriated to North Korea, but some would choose to remain in South Korea or even emigrate to other countries. For men like Kim, the choice was agonizing. Return home meant rejoining a society that now seemed incredibly limited compared to what he had witnessed in American films and prison camp life. But staying meant abandoning everything familiar, everyone he had ever known, his entire cultural identity. The repatriation process itself provided one final lesson in American organizational efficiency. Thousands of prisoners were processed through massive staging areas with the same systematic precision that had characterized everything else about American military operations. Medical examinations, documentation, transportation arrangements, all handled with clockwork efficiency and abundant resources. And throughout the process, the familiar elements of American mass culture remained present. Hot meals served on standardized trays, soft drinks available at every checkpoint, entertainment and distraction provided as routinely as medical care. Many prisoners received care packages for their journey home containing items that would have been luxury goods in North Korea. Chocolate bars, cigarettes, canned foods, and American magazines filled with images of suburban prosperity. The ships that carried repatriated prisoners back to North Korea in late 1953 and early 1954 were themselves symbols of American industrial might. Liberty ships and other mass-produced vessels, loaded with former prisoners and humanitarian supplies, representing the same productive capacity that had made Hollywood movies available in remote prison camps throughout the war. Kim Sung-ho stood at the rail of one such ship as it approached the North Korean coast in December 1953. In his baggage was a small notebook filled with observations about American society, sketches of movie scenes he had found particularly memorable, and English words he had learned from Hollywood films. As he looked out at the coastline of his homeland, he tried to prepare himself for the return to a world that now seemed impossibly constrained. The North Korea he was returning to had been devastated by 3 years of intensive bombing. Cities lay in ruins. The industrial infrastructure that had once seemed so impressive was now revealed as primitive compared to what he had witnessed in America, and the population had endured hardships that made his own prison camp experience seem comfortable by comparison. But Kim carried with him more than just memories and notebooks. He carried a fundamentally different understanding of what human society could achieve when it prioritized abundance over scarcity, efficiency over ideology, and individual satisfaction over collective sacrifice. The movies he had watched in American custody had shown him possibilities for human flourishing that he had never imagined, and those possibilities would remain with him for the rest of his life. The story doesn't end with repatriation and reconstruction. In the decades that followed the Korean War, many former prisoners of war became living bridges between two different approaches to organizing modern society. Some, like Kim, returned to North Korea and struggled to readjust to a system that now seemed limited and constraining. Others remained in the South or emigrated elsewhere, carrying with them insights gained from their unexpected exposure to American popular culture. The Hollywood movies that had once seemed so alien gradually became familiar parts of global culture. By the 1960s, American films were being shown in theaters around the world, spreading the same images of abundance, individual freedom, and casual prosperity that had so shocked North Korean prisoners in the early 1950s. The soft power that had been accidentally deployed in prison camps became a deliberate tool of American cultural influence, reaching audiences far beyond military facilities and war zones. Some former prisoners became entrepreneurs, applying lessons learned about efficiency and mass production to their own business ventures. Others became educators, teaching new generations about the importance of systems, thinking, and organizational culture. A few became cultural ambassadors, helping to bridge the gap between societies that had once been bitter enemies. The transformation wasn't just individual, it was civilizational. The Korea that emerged from the war's devastation gradually embraced many of the principles that former prisoners had first encountered in American prison camps. Efficiency, abundance, consumer satisfaction, and individual opportunity became central values in South Korean society, contributing to one of the most remarkable economic transformations in modern history. Today, South Korea is a global leader in technology, entertainment, and consumer goods. Young Koreans grow up watching Hollywood movies as routinely as American children do, and Seoul's movie theaters show the same films that play in New York and Los Angeles. The cultural gap that once seemed unbridgeable has largely disappeared, replaced by a shared global culture of mass entertainment and consumer abundance. But perhaps the most profound legacy of those prison camp movie screenings lies not in economic development or cultural exchange, but in a simple recognition of human nature itself. The North Korean prisoners who watched Charlie Chaplin comedies and Disney cartoons in American custody discovered something that transcended political ideology and national identity: the universal human hunger for beauty, laughter, and stories that help make sense of the world. The projector light that once seemed so alien and threatening became a symbol of possibility, illuminating not just a makeshift screen in a prison camp barracks, but alternative ways of thinking about what human society could become when it prioritized creativity over control, abundance over scarcity, and hope over fear. The war ended, the prisoners went home, and the projectors were packed away. But the ideas they had illuminated continued to spread, carried by men like Kim Sung-ho, who had discovered that even enemies could be generous, that entertainment could be more than propaganda, and that the true measure of a nation's strength might be found not in its willingness to sacrifice, but in its capacity to create joy, even for those who had once sought to destroy it. In the end, the North Korean prisoners who couldn't believe America let them watch Hollywood films in prison camps discovered something more valuable than military intelligence or strategic secrets. They discovered the power of abundance to transform understanding, the ability of art to transcend politics, and the revolutionary potential of a society confident enough to share its dreams even with its enemies. The movie ended, the credits rolled, and the projector clicked to silence. But the story it had told, about freedom, creativity, and the possibility of plenty, would echo through the decades to come, reshaping not just individual lives but entire civilizations. The light had gone out, but the vision it revealed would prove more durable than any fortress, more powerful than any weapon, and more revolutionary than any ideology. That perhaps is the ultimate lesson of those forgotten movie nights in Korean War prison camps. That sometimes the most profound victories are won not through force of arms, but through the simple act of sharing stories, creating laughter, and demonstrating that even in the darkest circumstances, there remains room for wonder, beauty, and hope.